The morning sun hung low over the Navy annex, flattening the flag against a pale November sky. Frank Danner parked his truck beside the visitor line and stepped out slowly, his left knee locking before it bent. He carried his service cap under one arm, the brim polished thin from years of quiet habit. Above the gate, the electronic board flickered Veterans Day 2024. Welcome home. He frowned. It was 2023. The sign hummed as if arguing with time itself. He joined the short queue, two contractors, one woman pushing a stroller. A security guard in a crisp new uniform raised a hand. "Sir, hold up. ID, please." Frank offered the badge that had followed him through 2 deployments and 23 years of maintenance bays. The plastic was clouded, the photo young. The scanner chirped red. This ID's not in the system anymore." The young guard's tone tried for polite. "You're not cleared to enter, sir." Frank blinked. The hum of the fluorescent canopy pressed around them. "Not cleared," he repeated the words, tasting like dust. "I came to stand for the roll call. That's all. Regulation changed last spring. Only active or invited personnel inside the perimeter." The guard glanced at his supervisor, eager not to seem soft. Behind them, the radio in the booth spilled a thin version of America the Beautiful. Frank didn't argue. He simply nodded once, thumb tracing the seam of his cap. "Rules age faster than people do," he said almost to himself. The guard shifted, uncomfortable. "Sir, I don't make the rules." "No," Frank murmured. "You just inherit them." He stepped aside so the line could move. A gust carried the smell of diesel and morning coffee from the base canteen. He closed his eyes for a second. The rhythm of the anthem wavered in the static. For a heartbeat, he could hear the engines from the ships he used to tune steady, dependable patient. Then the memory faded like a radio drifting out of range. Silent beat light flares on the gate mirror. He exhales slowly. A teenager walking past lifted his phone. "Man, they won't let you in. That's messed up." He hit record. Frank half smiled. Some rules don't know respect when they see it. The kid laughed nervously, not understanding, but the camera stayed on. Another guard poked his head out of the booth. "Problem, was." Ross shook his head. "Just protocol, sir." The phrase settled in the air like a lid. Protocol, not people. Inside, nothing stirred. Outside, veterans and family members queued under the glitching sign that insisted on the wrong year. Frank studied the board again. Maybe it wasn't a mistake. Maybe the system had simply moved ahead without him scheduling tribute for a tomorrow he no longer belonged to. He adjusted his cap, still unworn. The fabric was warm from his hand. He considered putting it on, but something about the act felt like asking permission. Sir Ross called softer now. "You could check in at the public lot. They're streaming the ceremony." Frank smiled. "That's all right. I came to remember not to enter." He set the cap against his chest, a salute to a memory, not to a flag. Ross watched him walk toward the fence line. He couldn't explain why the man's calm felt heavier than anger. Each measured step seemed to echo through the metal railing until even the speakers crackled and fell silent. Inside the booth, the anthem restarted from the top. Frank paused near the lot eyes on the parade field beyond the chain link. Chairs were set in rows, blue and white as ship hulls. He could almost see where he'd stood every November behind the engines, hands greased, listening for the commander's speech. He tightened his grip on the cap. The world inside the gate moved like a film he'd once helped project. Someone shouted for vehicles to clear lane 2. Ross watched him go, then looked again at the glitching sign 2024. It blinked, stopped, then returned to 2023. He wasn't sure which year was truer. Frank walked past the outer bench where families would wait for rides after the parade. The bench was empty. He rested his hand on the wood, feeling the grooves his own unit had carved years ago. No plaque remained, only paint and rain stains. He set the cap down for a moment, then picked it up again, as though testing the weight of memory. The automatic gate slid closed behind him. The sound was soft metal against metal, a door to some honor he still carried inside. The cafe across from the Navy Annex was half empty, the kind of place where the blinds never agreed on the angle of light. Frank Danner chose a seat by the window facing the gate. His coffee had long since gone cold, a thin film trembling on the surface each time a truck rolled by. Beside the cup lay his old ID badge. Its edges yellowed, the clip bent like a tired hinge. He placed it gently on a napkin, as though the plastic still deserved ceremony. From here he could see the security booth that had turned him away less than an hour ago. The digital sign above it now blinked steady, Veterans Day 2023. Maybe the world had corrected itself, or maybe it only pretended to. The cafe door jingled. A postal worker stepped in, cap tilted back, the smell of rain on his coat. He froze mid-stride when he recognized Frank. Years earlier, Frank had fixed the man's truck fleet radios. Now the younger man hesitated, eyes flicking between the badge on the table and the gate beyond. He gave a polite nod and sat far away. Respect required distance these days. Across the street, Sergeant Ross leaned against the guardrail, coffee in hand. His partner muttered, "Another old-timer thinking he matters." Ross didn't answer. The remark sat wrong in his gut. He watched through the heat haze as Frank lifted the badge and wiped it with a napkin, movements deliberate, tender. Frank's reflection stared back from the window, creased face, steady hands. "Rules age faster than people do," he whispered. His voice barely rose above the hum of the refrigerator case. The badge caught the morning glare and threw it across the table like a faint salute. Silent beat flagpole shimmer reflected in the glass. He pauses, breath held. The waitress came by, a woman with hair pinned in the style of the early 90s. She topped off his cup. "Refills on the house, sir." He smiled. "Didn't drink the first one fast enough." She set down a small slip of paper, $1 bill folded under the check, inked with the words, "Thank you for your service." He looked at it for a moment, then nodded. "Ma'am, that means more than clearance ever could." She didn't quite know what he meant, but she smiled anyway and moved on. The bell over the door chimed again. The moment passed. Outside, Ross's radio crackled. "Gate status nominal," someone reported. Ross answered mechanically, eyes still on the man in the cafe. Frank's calm unsettled him, the kind of composure you only earned after seeing systems break down and rebuilding them without applause. Ross muttered to himself, "Maybe rules aren't everything." His partner laughed. "Careful, you'll end up old and sentimental." Inside, Frank turned the badge over. The laminate had bubbled from heat, the picture nearly faded. He remembered the day it was printed, how the young clerk had joked that he looked too serious for maintenance. He'd replied, "Serious keeps aircraft from falling." He brushed a thumb across the badge again. "Funny thing about rules, son," he said quietly, as if continuing a conversation from years ago they never served a day. The postal worker finally approached, holding his empty cup like a peace offering. "Mr. Saltason, Danner, you still working down there?" Frank smiled. "Not for a while. Guess the computers decided I'm history." The man shifted awkwardly. "Well, they ought to keep you on the roll, that's for sure." Frank nodded. "Machines forget faster than people forgive." He rose, joints creaking like old hinges. and slipped the badge back into his wallet. The wallet's leather was cracked, the outline of the plastic visible even when it was gone. The waitress waved from behind the counter. He left $2 on the table, one for the refill, one for remembrance. Across the highway, Ross returned to the guard booth. His supervisor was on the phone, half listening. Yeah, an older gentleman name was Danner, Danner. He tried to come through earlier. The name reached another ear, Admiral Monroe seated in a paneled office deeper inside the base. He paused mid-signature. Say that name again. Frank Danner, sir. Retired engineer. Not in the system. Monroe's pen stilled. He'd heard that name before maintenance chief during the carrier overhaul 20 years ago. The man who had stayed on deck through a storm to keep a generator online. Monroe looked toward the window. From his floor, the gate was just a glint beyond the trees. Ross watched as his commander rose. Sir Monroe adjusted his cap eyes, narrowing. Where exactly did you say he was turned away? Main gate, north side. He's probably gone now. Monroe didn't answer. He was already moving toward the door. Back in the cafe, Frank finished the last sip of coffee. The flag's reflection trembled across the window, then steadied. He placed the empty cup over the dollar bill to keep it from blowing away, pocketed the wallet, and glanced once more toward the gate. The radio behind the counter changed stations without warning, marching drums fading into a soft ballad from the 70s. It sounded like home. Outside, Admiral Monroe stepped onto the walkway and looked toward the same horizon. The two men separated by a fence and 2 decades of regulation, both paused at the same moment, one carrying an old badge, the other an old memory of the man who had once kept his ship alive. The wind lifted, and the service cap in Frank's arm caught the light again. The day felt suddenly less like exclusion and more like rehearsal, something waiting to be corrected. The hallway leading to the Admiral's office smelled faintly of wax and old brass polish. Portraits lined both sides, smiling faces in uniforms, black and white plaques, etched with years and campaigns. Admiral Monroe walked slowly, cap tucked beneath his arm, the sound of his shoes echoing in the sterile air. The hum of fluorescent lights blended with the distant murmur of preparations for the Veterans Day ceremony outside. Halfway down, he stopped. There, under the soft glow of a flickering bulb, hung a photograph from 1986, a maintenance crew crowded around a half-open engine casing. At the center, younger Monroe, still an ensign, was half hidden behind another man, broad shoulders, calm expression, wrench in hand. Frank Danner. Monroe leaned closer. Dust gathered in the frame's corner, catching the light. Someone had written in faded marker, OSS Raleigh Emergency Repair Team. He remembered that day, the engine fire, the panic, the way the deck trembled under their boots. He had been shouting orders into the noise voice, lost in chaos. Then Frank had stepped forward, voice steady as the tide. "Stop yelling, sir," he'd said, not unkindly. "Engines don't listen when people panic." Back then, Monroe had flushed angry at the audacity. But Frank hadn't waited for permission. He had dropped to one knee, opened the access panel, and guided 2 sailors with gestures sharper than commands. Within minutes, the sputtering roar had softened into rhythm. The ship had lived because someone had listened before giving orders. Monroe exhaled through his nose, a half-smile tugging at the edge of his jaw. "He taught me to listen before I command," he murmured. The corridor returned only the buzz of old wiring. He adjusted his cap, squared his shoulders, and looked again at the photo. Frank's eyes, even frozen in print, held that same patience, a quiet certainty that didn't need to shout to lead. Around him, the younger crew had worn expressions of fear. Frank looked composed even then, as if chaos recognized him and stood down. Behind Monroe, the PA system crackled to life. All personnel, final rehearsal for Veterans Day ceremony in 10 minutes. Anchors away will play on cue. The familiar tune spilled from the speakers, the march bright and confident. It echoed down the hall, bouncing off marble and glass. Monroe stood still, the music washing over him like surf over a memory. He remembered how Frank had hummed that same melody once under his breath, while tightening bolts no one else could reach. Back then, Monroe had thought it superstition. Now he recognized it for what it was, focus. He took a slow breath, voice barely audible. He's the reason this base still stands. A young lieutenant hurried by, clipboard in hand. Admiral, the press team's waiting at the reviewing stand. Monroe didn't turn. Tell them to start without me. The officer hesitated. Sir, the commander's remarks. I'll speak when it matters. Monroe said, adjusting the brim of his cap. His tone was quiet but final. He walked on, passing plaques and shadowed corners, each one whispering names half-remembered. His reflection drifted along the polished wall, an outline moving beside the photographs of those who had built the base brick by brick. The hallway narrowed toward the exit, the light shifting from fluorescent white to natural gold leaking through the glass doors. The Admiral paused at the end of the hall. Through the window, he could see the outer gate where Frank had stood that morning. The security team still moved in patterns, unaware that history was looping back on itself. Monroe touched the frame of the photo one last time, the cool glass grounding him. For a moment he imagined the hum of that old engine again, the one Frank had coaxed back to life when everyone else had lost faith. He turned toward the corridor door. He taught me to listen. He repeated softly, and I'm still listening. The words hung in the air like a vow. The door hissed open. The glare from outside spilled across the floor, stretching his shadow long and thin down the hallway. The shadow merged with the line of veterans' photos until it looked like one of them had stepped forward to walk beside him. Behind him, the loudspeakers reached the final verse of Anchors Away. The brass faded, replaced by faint applause drifting through the corridor vents, the rehearsal underway. Monroe didn't look back. He walked straight ahead, out of the climate-controlled comfort of ceremony and into the crisp air that smelled faintly of jet fuel and salt. Outside, the sound of the parade swelled in the distance, a celebration he was supposed to lead. But all he heard now were his own footsteps echoing on the concrete, marking the start of something that felt larger than protocol. The afternoon light burned low over the Navy Annex, turning the metal of the front gate into liquid gold. Frank Danner had made it half across the service road when the faint hum of the base loudspeakers faded into static. The Veterans Day ceremony had begun without him. Distant voices carried the cadence of names being read aloud. He stopped for a breath. The service cap rested under his arm, creases sharp brim dulled by time. He turned it once in his hands, tracing the embroidery, as if it might explain why he had come after all. He was about to head toward his truck when a car door closed behind him. From the far end of the drive, Admiral Monroe emerged, hat in hand, walking with a pace that made the guards hesitate. Sergeant Ross stiffened by the booth, unsure whether to salute or to apologize. The radio inside the checkpoint crackled with half-finished orders. Then silence. Monroe didn't speak. He walked until only a few feet separated him from Frank. The air between them held 20 years of unspoken recognition. Around them, the world slowed the flags in mid-flutter, the hum of the gate motor frozen in its arc. Monroe's eyes stayed on Frank, steady, apologetic, proud. Then he lifted his right-hand fingers, brushing the brim of his own cap, the Admiral's crest gleaming under the afternoon light, and removed it. The motion was simple. Yet in that instant, every layer of protocol cracked. Protocol slammed to a halt. The guards froze mid-salute. The ceremony speakers cut off mid-name. Even the wind seemed to pause, as if refusing to move without permission from the moment itself. Monroe stood bareheaded before the gate, sunlight crowning the silver in his hair. He didn't speak at first. Neither did Frank. Two men, one who had stayed behind, one who had moved ahead, met in the space where orders end and honor begins. Frank's fingers tightened on the brim of his cap. He didn't raise it. He didn't salute. He only nodded once, a quiet act that carried the weight of every salute he had ever given. Moisture gathered in his eyes, not from sorrow, but from the relief of finally being seen. Monroe's voice broke the stillness, low but carrying. "Welcome home, Chief," Frank answered without hesitation. "I never left." Behind the fence, the choir rehearsing for the ceremony had stopped mid-verse. Then softly, as if sensing the change, their voices resumed, "Abide with me," the hymn rolling over the tarmac in slow, forgiving waves. The tone was imperfect, human, beautiful. A gust of wind lifted the edge of Frank's sleeve, catching the faded navy patch still stitched there. The flag overhead moved again, slower now, the sound of fabric folding like a long sigh. Ross swallowed hard, whispering to no one. "Sir, the gate's open." Monroe glanced toward him, then back to Frank. "Leave it open," he said quietly. "Just leave it open." The order wasn't written anywhere. It didn't need to be. For the first time all day, regulation had given way to respect. Silent beat. The two men stand motionless, wind and heartbeat the only sounds. A single camera mounted on the gatepost caught the reflection of the moment. Monroe's cap lowered, Frank's head slightly bowed, sunlight catching the frame like a halo. The image froze as if the base itself wanted to remember. Across the loudspeaker, no commands followed. No applause. Just the low hum of wind through steel and the quiet hymn carrying the final line, "Shine through the gloom and point me to the skies." The camera light blinked once, capturing the frame forever. Fade to silence. On-screen caption, "Respect needs no orders." By morning, the video had already spread, grainy footage from the security camera showing Admiral Monroe removing his cap before the old man at the gate. No speeches, no sound, just the silent motion and the light catching the brim like a halo. Within hours, it was everywhere: veterans forums, base newsletters, even the local evening broadcast. The caption read, "Respect needs no orders." At the gate, the usual buzz of clearance calls had slowed to a hush. Sergeant Ross stood by the fence, his uniform pressed, but his posture softer. He replayed the clip on his phone for the fourth time, thumb hovering over the screen. He never shouted, he murmured, and that's why we heard him. Behind him, one of the younger guards, the same who'd laughed the day before, approached carrying a folded sheet of paper. "Sir, I made something." He held it up, block letters scrawled with a blue marker. "Thank you for your service." Ross nodded. "Hang it on the fence." Within an hour more, notes appeared, some on napkins, others on copy paper. A few small flags were wedged into the chain links. The old service cap and badge, once tucked under Frank's arm, had been hung gently side by side. Their edges fluttered in the November wind, tapping softly against the wire, like two voices finding harmony. Americana cue, distant choir practicing under the church porch, the faint rise of "Abide with me." Cars began to slow along the access road. People stopped, hands in their coat pockets, unsure whether to approach. Then someone placed a single white candle in the dirt by the gatepost. Another followed with a small bouquet of carnations wrapped in grocery paper. By noon, the chain-link fence looked less like security and more like a memorial, proof that silence could travel farther than command. Ross leaned against the post, head bowed. Never thought a rule book could feel this heavy, he said. His partner shrugged. Guess the book just got rewritten. Silent beat wind passes through the fence, the hat trembles. The badge clicks faintly against metal. Across the street, the cafe waitress stepped outside, apron still on, holding the dollar bill Frank had left. She slipped it through the fence beneath the cap. The inked words, "Thank you for your service," faced outward, now visible to every car that passed. An old radio on the guard desk played a slow broadcast summary. Yesterday, during preparations for the Veterans Day ceremony, Admiral Monroe halted proceedings to honor retired engineer Frank Danner, who had been denied entry due to outdated records. Ross turned down the volume. He wasn't looking for an apology, he said. His partner nodded. No. He was looking for proof we'd learned something. The wind lifted again, scattering fallen leaves across the service road. Each gust made the cap sway gently, the badge glinting in rhythm. The sound was faint, like applause wrapped in reverence. The camera at the gate, still running, caught the movement light, bending cloth, trembling, turning the moment into an unspoken vow. That evening, welders from the base arrived with a small bronze plaque. The lettering was simple, in honor of Frank Danner. Because he stood quiet. They mounted it on the same fence where the cap still hung. The metal gleamed new paint, still drying the scent of lacquer, mixing with salt wind. When the sun set, the reflection of the plaque caught the last ray of light and sent it back toward the flagpole. 1 year later, the base library smelled faintly of polish and paper, an aroma of stories kept safe. Rows of folding chairs filled the reading room, veterans in pressed jackets sitting beside schoolchildren who fidgeted with tiny flags. At the front, under soft track lighting, a glass display case stood open. Inside lay a faded service cap and a bronze plaque, both mounted on velvet, their reflections joined as one. A small card beneath read, "Because he stood quiet." Sergeant Ross, now in dress blues, stepped up to the lectern. His voice trembled only once before settling into steadiness. They tried to stop him once he said, glancing toward the photograph beside the display, "But now the gate stays open in his name." A murmur rippled through the room, a mix of pride and humility. Frank Danner sat quietly in the back row, hands folded over a new cap, navy wool still crisp. The years had softened his face, but not his eyes. He didn't seek attention. He never had. Still, he listened the way he had taught others to. Ross continued. "We built new training protocols this year. They start with a single sentence, respect needs no orders. Every recruit learns that before they ever touch a uniform." The audience applauded lightly, not out of ceremony but agreement. Ross looked toward the rear, found Frank among the crowd, and nodded once. Frank returned it, the same silent acknowledgement that had once broken the weight of command at the gate. Hearts moment number 6. As he came to remember, and made us remember too. The librarian dimmed the lights slightly. On a projector screen behind Ross, photos cycled through the gate. The notes on the fence, the candlelit vigil. Finally, the image of the plaque filled the wall, bronze and bright. Ross's voice lowered to a near whisper. "Service never retires." Replay trigger, equal 12 words, caption ready line at 0110S. Applause rose brief and sincere. A bugler in the corner played the first notes of taps. Frank closed his eyes, the melody threading through him like memory restored. Silent beat camera pans from plaque. Open gate outside the library lawn, sunlight streaming through. Outside, the breeze carried the hymn from the chapel across the street. The porch swing by the library creaked lazily, brass hinges, keeping time with the rhythm of fading ceremony. Frank stepped out quietly, leaving the murmurs behind. The late afternoon light turned the flag pale gold. He stopped beside the bench outside the library doors. Setting his new cap on the wooden seat, he traced the engraved lettering above it, Quiet Service Wall. The sunlight spilled across both, blurring their outlines, until they looked like a single shape, memory and present joined. For a long moment he didn't move. The swing creaked once more, slow and even. Then he smiled, small and certain, as though the sound itself was saying goodbye. The frame faded to black text, appearing softly, inspired by true acts of quiet courage. The library doors stayed open that evening, brass hinges sighing as the wind drifted through. Inside, the plaque and service cap gleamed beneath the lamplight, catching the faint hum of the old record player turning anchors away. Frank sat near the porch window, watching the flag move gently across the glass, like a slow heartbeat. Each fold a story, each crease a name remembered. He thought of how rules had once stopped him at a gate, and how silence had opened another one. Some men fight with orders, others with patience, and both leave marks the wind cannot erase. The cap in that glass case wasn't his anymore. It belonged to everyone who had ever waited to be seen.